Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are, whether you're from Australia, America, Canada, England, Ireland, wherever you're from, you're so welcome to the channel, and especially my subscribers, I send you so much love. I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing fabulous, thank you very much, and all the better for spending some quality time with you, and I've got a fabulous story for you tonight that you're going to love. But before we get started, don't forget to get that quintessential drink because you know the rules. And if it's absolutely sensational or something that nobody's heard of, do let me know what it is that you're drinking. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, I had been trapped and isolated in the Torrent Tower room of our Queen Anne-style home for over 2 years. It had become my refuge, my prudent sanctuary, my safe place to shelter and shield myself from the dangers and hazards of the big bad world, like a large bubble of protection that enveloped me in a seal of security. Even the rest of my house was like a field of landmines, potentially explosive and completely terrifying, where the enemy could be lurking and hiding out behind the sofas or in our large pantry in the kitchen, ready to launch a full-scale attack upon me, as I had personalised my fear, and it certainly felt like the battle of me against the entire world. I was like the quintessential circumspect princess, tucked away in a misanthropic castle with my tiny, joyful companion, a Yorkshire Terrier called Bundles, for company. My parents and siblings visited my room daily and brought me all my meals like a fast food delivery service. I refused to step away from the unassailable confines of my own impregnable fortress, causing my family an overwhelming amount of grief and anxiety as a result. They pondered as to what to do about my current situation and dilemma, for my enigmatic, incongruous behaviour perplexed them greatly, leaving them with feelings of hopelessness and despair. For no one should be entombed in their bedroom forever. How had it come to this, I wondered? A while ago I would have laughed at the mere idea that I was ever live a stifling, claustrophobic and contained life like this, constricted to a small space like a string of pearls, relegated to its jewellery box, never ever to see the light of day again, or like a deep-sea fish, strangled in a net of its own making. I would never have envisaged such a limited future for myself, and certainly have contemplated the sanity of such a person that was too afraid to leave the perimeters of their own bedroom as bordering on the completely insane and irrational. Indeed, I had heard of such eccentric people before, suffering from this debilitating psychological condition, with very little sympathy. For indeed, an incommodious life without any challenges was no life at all as far as I was concerned. It would seem that running away from your life was like hiding away from living life to the fullest. Now the person that I had little sympathy for was myself, and being on the other side of the fence made me see things in a whole new stance. It would seem that fear ruled my life with a ruthless iron rod, and had held me hostage and prisoner in my own bedroom. But I was the judge, jury, and executioner that had laid down the penalties, delivering a stiff sentence to myself of perpetual isolation and seclusion from the world. My life appeared to offer me so much potential. Well, that was me at one time, but not any more. It was just one day when things transformed in an instant for me, like clear sunny weather suddenly overcome by looming dark thunderclouds and threatening jagged yellow lightning flashing across the sky. And in seconds the clouds burst open and the thunder rumbled, thrashed and boomed, and before you knew it, you were caught up in a storm, vulnerable, wet and very exposed. It was exactly like that for me. It was like a brief second of time when my life collapsed and disintegrated like a crumbling, dilapidated building, never to be the same again. How I wished I could turn back the clock and undo that time again, for I would have done everything so differently, and never left the house at 11 p.m. that Saturday morning, when the precarious hands of fate would blow my world wide apart. It had all started out like any normal day, probably better than most, for the long drawn-out winter of freezing, repetitive cold days was behind us, and this was the first real glorious day of summer. There was an upbeat, vibrant enthusiasm in the air, which was very contagious, where people discarded their heavy coats and gloves to the back of the wardrobe and brought out their light cotton cool summer clothes. I was excited to dive into my yellow dress with its white pattern of daisies on the cool, pretty fabric that I'd been longing to wear for quite some time. "Don't you look magnificent?" said my mother, coming into my bedroom. "Oh, go on, girl, give me a twirl." "I love that yellow colour on you. It's spectacular," she said. "You look so vibrant. It reminds me of the fashion in the 60s. You just need a pair of white boots and you'll look the part. You'll certainly make all your friends look very dull and drab, showing up in that stunner, I assure you of that." "So you like the dress?" I asked her, looking very pleased. "I must say I do like the material. It rather reminds me of spring." "Love it, I adore it, sweetheart," piped my mother. "You look incredible." My father entered my bedroom with a huge beam on his face. "Oh, my word," he said. "You look amazing. Where are you going, sweetheart?" "I'm going for brunch up the road with some of my friends from the university." "Don't eat too much," my mother teased. "I've invited the Sullivans over to dinner this evening, and I'm laying out a great spread. We're having cob salad, tater tots, pot roast and roasted vegetables, mashed potatoes, plenty of gravy and mac and cheese, followed by your favourite key lime pie." "Well, I wouldn't miss it for the world," I teased. "It sounds so yummy." All of a sudden, my older brother and younger sister entered the room. "You look $1,000,000, said Cordelia, gasping as she admired my dress. "Oh, I hope you'll lend it to me. That dress is gorgeous." "I agree," teased my brother. "You do look $1,000,000. "Thanks," I said, my cheeks flushing crimson from all the compliments, as my family members gathered around me as though they were admiring the stylish mannequins in a clothes shop window. I was in my early 20s at the time, studying medicine at university. I walked down the stone steps of our burgundy-coloured Victorian house, feeling on top of the world, boosted by the unexpected compliments doled out generously by my family members, who were not inclined to ever be effusive. I glanced briefly at my wristwatch. It was 11 o'clock. A little early, perhaps, but I was enjoying walking down the streets with the radiant beams of blissful sunshine soaking my body in a pleasurable warmth. I had all the time in the world, so I decided to enjoy a leisurely stroll down the tree-lined streets of Toronto, where I was going to meet up with my other girlfriends at the local cafe for a friendly brunch. I was looking very forward to it. In a trice the world changed. It took possibly a second, and no more, but much can happen in a second. I could hear a car speeding down the tarmac of the street unnaturally fast, and the tyres squeaked and squawked. No one should drive at an outrageous speed in a residential area, surely, I thought fleetingly. I mean, it was asking for trouble. It was inviting an accident, like an unwanted guest to a dinner party that you would sooner rather avoid. One moment the road appeared wide open and safe, and then this black Buick seemed to be spinning out of control and somersaulting in the air before me, while bodies that looked like flimsy, delicate china dolls were flung out of the open windows, smashing to the ground like boiled eggs. For a moment, time stood still. And then there was an earth-shattering noise, the crunching, the crashing, smashing sounds of metal crumbling and folding and hitting the ground violently with a powerful force, and an acrid smell was unleashed into the atmosphere that was very nasty. It was like a scene of great carnage. All of a sudden, rolling towards me like a soccer ball in a stadium, was the decapitated head of the driver, a young man of a mere 21 years old. It rolled towards me, stopped stationary at my feet, and the vacant brown eye stared back at me from the glazed sockets. I began to scream and scream. I discerned body parts scattered over the road that included a single foot dangling from the jagged metal of the car. and a mangled hand caught up under the wheel, while the grey granular tarmac was spattered with blood, congealed fat, bone and brain matter. It was a horrendous scene that no one should ever have to witness, while my body for a moment seemed to be disabled by a paralysing fear. Was I dreaming, I wondered? But I realised I was very much awake. I was witnessing something that was real, inflamed, raw and tortuous, and it was unfolding before my eyes like the most horrifying movie that I'd ever watched. I dashed over to the neighbour's bush and began to hurl up the contents of my stomach in disgusted revulsion. In a trice the streets were lined with people that emerged from every nook and cranny like hundreds of rabbits scurrying out of their burrows. The residents hovered around the accident scene like frantic bees in a desperate frenzy, while police were pushing the gawking onlookers away. "Get out of the way! Get out of the way, please, everybody! Just get back! Get back! The emergency services are here! Now get back! Get back!" Ambulances with their ear-piercing sirens arrived on the scene in seconds, with EMTs rushing towards the victims of the tragedies with their trolleys, and the flashing blue and red lights of emergency vehicles were absolutely everywhere. Tragically, there were no survivors in this perilous accident, as no one was wearing a safety belt. The young driver had been showing off his bedazzling brand-new car he'd received from his parents as a birthday present, showing it off to his friends by driving at a very fast speed. His car was a 1985 Buick Electra and was now just a mangled piece of metal. I witnessed bodies strewn on gurneys, wrapped up in body bags, and being placed in the back of emergency vehicles. You could feel the air was saturated and impregnated with a heavy, oppressive energy of a great underlying sadness and grievous disappointment that no one's life could be saved or spared. "Dreadful accident," said one officer to another. "Why, they weren't wearing their safety belts. It beats me. Youngsters these days, they probably think they're invincible. You know, kids that think they'll live forever." "Even so," said the other officer, "driving at such a speed in a residential area is crazy." "It's called showing off to your friends," came the reply. "Why do parents do it? Buy their kids such expensive, extravagant, deadly gifts for their birthdays. A car in the wrong hands can be as lethal and as hazardous as a missile." In the end, it would seem I was the only live victim from the scene of the accident, but my injuries were the invisible kind that are indelibly marked on your psyche, never to be forgotten. I was hospitalised for several days, undergoing sedation and trauma counselling. As I gather, I had been unable to stop screaming at the accident scene. In truth, I have no recollection of that event that was erased from my mind like the chalk off a teacher's blackboard, permanently gone, swiped forever. From thenceforth my life changed, and my confidence and sense of security was eroded and suctioned out of my life. I no longer trusted the world, and shrank and retreated away from it like a tortoise in my shell, desperate to hide away from it all, as the world outside my turret tower room became a bad and dangerous place. It would seem over 2 years no psychologist or prescription medicine could shift me out of my sequestered, cloistered, hermit-like existence, and my desperate parents and my brother Lawrence and sister Cordelia had pretended to my friends that I was spending time in Italy indefinitely. They knew that it would be humiliating for me to ever have to admit that I was locked away in my ivory tower. In truth, I thought there would never be any light at the end of the tunnel, but one day that changed, as it seemed that a touch of the miraculous had infused my life with the sweet scent of victory. The angel responsible for my dramatic, radical transformation was called Leonora. She was my new psychologist, and she wasn't cut out of the same cloth of other mental health care workers that had visited me prior. They had failed abysmally to deliver me from my incarceration. Leonora, on the other hand, followed her heart and natural instincts, rather than the staunch protocol of her medical training that was too rigidly uniform for her. She was a pretty young woman in her late 30s, with a luxurious mane of long auburn hair, and a porcelain, fair, flawless complexion. I could hear my mother whispering and warning her not to upset me because I was a sensitive soul. The elegant woman entered my room like a breath of fresh air, and her soft, lingering, flowery perfume rather reminded me of fresh summer roses. She studied me intently through her judicious, discriminating blue eyes, shaking her mane of golden hair furiously, with a look of extreme indignation on her face, rather like a vet examining an animal in a shoddy, bedraggled condition, and not being altogether very pleased about it. This perfect stranger was not afraid to unleash some brutal hard truths that rolled off her tongue with effortless ease, like lethal missiles that hit me hard and were like cruel blows. "Do you know how pathetic you look, stuck in this room?" she said, walking over to the curtains and drawing them back to allow the light to flood the room. "Why on earth would you shut yourself away like this and block out the light of a beautiful day like this? It's ridiculous. You're not a bat, for goodness sake." I sat there in silence, trying to barricade the unkind words from me that were beginning to sting like jellyfish bites. "So is this the way you're going to play it?" she said. "You're just going to ignore me. Is that right? I knew you were pathetic the moment I laid eyes on you." "You are rude," I said. "I don't want to talk to you." "Well, if I'm rude, I can live with that, because I don't have to stay rude forever. But you're pathetic, and you'll stay pathetic all your life if you live in this prison," she piped. "All this," she continued, "the way you live is completely pathetic, and I blame your parents for giving in to your demands. You want everybody to feel sorry for you, and pussyfoot around you cautiously, wrapping you up in cotton wool like a fine piece of bone china that they're absolutely terrified to break. They're afraid to hurt your feelings. Now that's a crazy way to live, if you ask me. I can see that even your little Yorkshire Terrier here has had quite enough. Is that not right?" she said, stroking my dog. "Woof, woof," said my dog in agreement. I thought he was on my side. Traitor, I thought to myself. "I suffer from agoraphobia," I piped. "I have a real sickness." "Well, I'm a psychologist," she said to me, "and I look on those medical terminologies as quintessential excuses from my patients that they can cling on to like a lilo in a swimming pool. Granted, you have been traumatized, and I don't deny that for a moment, but it's still a perfect excuse not to make any real effort to get out of your current situation. The truth is, you're in complete denial. You're failing to see the truth. This room is as likely to burst into flames just as much as you are likely to be run over by a bus in the morning. You need to understand that we live our lives facing risks every single day. We have no control over the universe, as anything can happen at any time and anywhere, no matter where you are. Do you realise the only thing that you're actually running from is yourself? Now that's truly pathetic, because you're never going to get away from yourself." I had never thought about it like that before, and this impertinent, impudent woman that I initially loathed with a passion over a period of time, I finally grew to love and appreciate like a sister. She was the only person who audaciously removed the blinders from my eyes, made me see how foolish and futile it was, hiding myself away from the world and failing to live my life to the fullest. Soon I began to feel like my old self again, as if I'd resurfaced from a long hibernation like a bear, and was now hungry to experience life. I visited pizza parlours, met friends for lunch, and took walks in the local park, and my family was overjoyed by my miraculous recovery. Of course, I never revealed to my friends why I'd been away for so long, and they were disappointed to discover that I didn't know how to speak a word of Italian. But if they were suspicious, they never said anything. "Your father and I are so proud of you," my mother said to me. "You've come such a long way. There were times we never thought you would leave your bedroom. It worried us greatly." "I'm just so grateful that you persevered, Mother," I said, giving her a huge hug. "I believe Leonora saved me. She was able to show me that I couldn't run from myself, and that I should learn to accept the spontaneity in life, and I know she was right." "She's not your typical psychologist, is she?" said my mother. but the only one who managed to get through to you. And she wasn't kind in the beginning at all, because she really rattled you quite considerably and gave you a hard time. I guess she just pushed me into the deep end, and I either had to sink or swim, and I chose to swim, I said. One day Leonora told me that she had another project for me to complete to help crack open my shell of independence. I want you to go camping with a friend or with both of your siblings, because being up and close to nature and sleeping under the stars will be a great experience for you, and I really want you to enjoy it. It'll be your first night sleeping away from home. This was a big deal for me. My sister Cordelia and my brother Lawrence were coming camping with me, and we were all enthused about this idea. I surprised myself by losing my apprehension and inhibitions like an old garment I decided to discard. I could feel the once suppressed adventuress inside my character making a startling reappearance, and I began to feel really good. We took the 4-hour flight from Toronto to Calgary International Airport, where we hired a 1980s Suzuki Samurai vehicle, which Lawrence drove down some dirt roads towards a private camping ground that was in close proximity to Banff National Park, that overlooked exquisite mountainous terrain, impressive glaciers, scenic valleys, flowery meadows, sumptuous forests, and bedazzling rivers. Before long we set up camp, pitching up our tents and preparing our fire pit on a sizable clearing, directly opposite a lake with an exquisite turquoise sheen that was surrounded by a backdrop of statuesque sculptural mountains with large clusters of evergreen trees that included Engelmann spruce and logpole pines, padding out a third of its base with a thick verdant quilting. On the left side of our camp was a sizable mountainous gradient where a sylvan spiralled in its upward ascent and was filled with rugged hiking and horse-riding trails, and on our right was a pretty bedazzling flowering meadow bursting with colourful wild flowers like blue tansies, yellow buttercups, yarrow, wild Alberta pink roses and sage, and it was also frequently dotted with the occasional cluster of spruce trees. I watched my sister Cordelia open a big bottle of French champagne, while my brother prepared the fire pit. "What is all this in aid of?" I said, smiling. "Why the expensive champagne? What are we celebrating?" "We're celebrating you, Arabella. You've come so far, and we never imagined you'd ever go camping with us," said Cordelia, her eyes misting over with tears. "There were times when you were locked away in your ivory tower that we thought we'd lost you forever, but it's like you are back home again to roost, and we're so terribly happy." "I agree," said Lawrence, looking at me with a very proud expression on his face. "We have our beautiful, intrepid explorer back again, the girl that is not afraid of anything." "Hold on," I exclaimed. "I wouldn't go that far. Maybe at one time, but not any more." "Don't be so hard on yourself," teased my brother. "I think I can see glimpses of your valiant side reappearing again, like a perennial flower. So let's drink to you, shall we?" "To Arabella," he said, raising his glass. "To Arabella," repeated my sister, toasting me with huge smiles on their faces. "Who's hungry?" said my brother, applying 3 hunky-looking steaks and generous-sized burgers to the grill, while Cordelia opened the different packages of the salads that she'd found in the delicatessens in Banff that looked delectable, from pasta dishes to potato salads. I could feel my mouth watering, and as my fork broke open the steak and the juices poured out, they melted in my mouth like butter. I couldn't remember a time when anything tasted this delicious. "I just love the town of Banff," said Cordelia. "Such a pretty, quaint place. It gives you the sense that you really are on holiday. It has that Aspen feel about it, only it's way better. It's more laid back, charming and congenial, don't you think?" We nodded as the food was excellent, so much so we didn't want to focus on talking at all. After our al fresco meal, we went for a short walk in the Sylvan, which was very invigorating. We eagerly climbed up the precipitous mountainous trail in our leather walking boots, enjoying the panoramic, breathtaking views through the trees overlooking the lower valley, where the rippling lake shimmered and twinkled like a turquoise gem. The forest was exquisitely beautiful, as the pyramid-shaped evergreen trees reached up into the high heavens like tall statues, clustering together like resplendent emerald-green jewels. The underbrush was richly carpeted with luxuriant ferns and soft mosses. I can assure you, after being trapped in a bedroom for a couple of years, getting up close and personal to the natural world was simply marvellous for me. I felt like a caged tiger that had finally escaped the confines of my zoo enclosure. We took turns to observe our camping spot from this high elevation through the binoculars in a little overhang between the trees. "What is that?" I asked, studying something very dark moving towards our campsite and glancing at it with a curious interest. It looked like a bear, but it didn't, for there was something human about this creature. My hands were shaking with excitement as I focused in on it, but its black, shadowy shape moved so fast and swiftly to get an effective focus. "What did you see?" asked Cordelia, grabbing the binoculars from me. I could hear the tone of her voice drop with disappointment. "Don't see anything," she said. "It was black, it was hairy, it was big," I piped. "Well, that would be a bear," laughed Lawrence. "He probably latched on to the smell of our food. Bears have got a superior sense of smell, even more pronounced than that of a dog." "You're not worried about your safety?" he asked. "I have brought a rifle with me and some bear spray, so I doubt the creature's going to give us any problems." "It's not that," I said. "It's just this bear-like creature had a human face. I'm sure of it." "I think you must have had a wee bit too much champagne, sis," said Lawrence teasingly. "Or you've been locked away in your castle for far too long and have forgotten what a bear looks like." I knew he was right. That must be what it was. I'd drunk far too much champagne, and it had gone straight to my head, and I was beginning to see things that weren't there. It does happen. I could hear the tweets of the birds' song as I woke the following morning. I had been very drowsy, and the moment my head had hit the pillow, I had drifted into a deep sleep. I opened my eyes cautiously as the sun was pouring on my face, causing my eyes to squint. It was a pleasant morning, and the sunshine was exceedingly enjoyable. But what on earth was I doing lying in a sleeping bag in the middle of a flowery meadow? Truly, I was astonished. How had I got here, I wondered? I should have been in my tent. I then realised that my sister and brother had taken the Leonora approach and thrust me in the middle of the meadow as some kind of practical joke, but I didn't find their actions very amusing, really. "Oh, there you are," said Lawrence. "I was wondering where you'd got to. What are you doing here in the middle of the meadow in your sleeping bag, if you don't mind me asking?" "Don't act like you don't know," I said. "Nice try, Lawrence, but I know you brought me here last night to sleep under the stars. I know your game plan." "That's where you're wrong," said Lawrence. "I didn't," he said, looking surprised. "Maybe the alcohol went straight to your head. You must have come out here in the middle of the night, in a plastered state. You were rather tipsy last night, I have to admit. People do crazy things when they're drunk. I can assure you of that." "Remind me never to drink again," I said, looking startled. "I can't believe it. I must have wandered out here in the middle of the night. I think I must have a low tolerance for alcohol." The following evening, after an exquisite day of hiking and exploring, I certainly resisted the urge to have any alcohol after what had happened to me the previous night. I couldn't trust myself to drink, lest I should pull a crazy stunt like that again. I liked to sleep near the door of the tent, and so I woke up in the night to feel myself being swept up in the air in my sleeping bag with an effortless, seamless ease. But I pretended to be fast asleep. I was terribly pleased. I'd caught my brother red-handed, and he was transporting me to the flowery meadow as a practical joke. But I would go along with it for a moment, and then give him the scare of his life. It would serve him right. I was surprised how graceful my brother's steps were, as he never bumped me once on the journey, and he laid me down on the ground very gracefully. I could hear him chuckling to himself. He thought he was so clever, and that his hoax was terribly funny. I rose up from my sleeping bag like an unsuspecting serpent and pounced on the shadowy form that I perceived was my brother. But this thing that carried me into the meadow had not been my brother at all, but something else. But what was it? I stared at the anomalous humanoid creature in absolute astonishment, and our eyes met for a moment. The light of the moon, I suppose it provided enough illumination to see a little bit, because I saw him, well, pretty well. He was tall and lanky, about 6 foot, I imagine, with wide shoulders, and possibly about 400 pounds. I couldn't be quite sure about that. But he was covered in long flowing dark hair, but the exact colour was obscured by the dusky darkness. This was the type of creature I'm quite sure I'd seen on the first day of the camp, the creature that looked like a bear with a human face. It stared at me curiously with amused dark eyes that glinted with a red eyeshine. I could discern he had a juvenile mischievous energy about him, and he heartily enjoyed playing pranks. The creature began to chuckle, and it wasn't much different to a human chuckle. He proceeded to point at my sleeping bag with his overlong arms, chuckling all the time, as if to say, "I fooled you, and you had no idea it was me." He was right, of course. I hadn't known it was him. I began to laugh heartily, as the creature's humour was infectious. His mannerisms, his body movements, and his facial expressions were incredibly comical, and I wasn't intimidated or frightened about him. I sensed his energy was congenial, and I was very responsive to that. The creature made some strange snoring sounds and pointed directly at me, and then he chuckled. "I know," I said. "I am told I have a dreadful snore, and I believe I do sound as bad as that." The creature watched me as I rolled up my sleeping bag into a tight ball and proceeded to walk back to my camp, with the creature following beside me. He appeared to be an effusive, gregarious character that wasn't reticent in any way, because he chatted to me all the way almost as if he'd known me all my life, in a very strange dialogue I didn't understand, that was very fast and very chirpy. I nodded to him as if I understood every single word he was saying, so as not to appear rude or offhand. When I got to my tent, I used my body language, signing to him to stay and wait exactly where he was, and he seemed to understand my language. I brought out my favourite 80s yo-yo with a Coca-Cola sign attached to it, and demonstrated to the creature exactly how to use it. I put on my headlamp to enhance my visibility. The creature examined the logo of the yo-yo with an expression of delight on his face, for he seemed to find it beautiful. He looked up at me with thrilled eyes, and he put his slender finger into the string and propelled the circular plastic thing up and down, and he was completely over the moon with my gift. After nodding my goodbyes to the creature, I returned to my tent and then fell into a deep sleep, to awake in the morning screaming, as something slippery was rubbing up and down my legs. It was a large fish. I smiled to myself. I guessed it was from the creature. He'd clearly put this fish into my sleeping bag so that I would know it was from me. It obviously was a gift from him. I ate it for breakfast that morning and shared it with my 2 siblings, who wondered where I'd got such a phenomenal-sized fish from, but I told them nothing. This was my secret that I intended on keeping. I never saw the creature again, as we returned to Toronto that very afternoon, nor did I tell anyone about my anomalous encounter with what I believe was a juvenile Bigfoot. So there you are. That's my story. What an extraordinary story. Thank you so much for sharing that, Arabella. Until next time, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Goodbye and good night.